1989, I have a distinct memory of coming home and seeing a giant box on our living room table. I was 7 years old, and I had no idea what this was. I opened it up, and it was a Nintendo Entertainment System. This console would come to change who I am as a person from 7 years old, and pretty much up until today. And it would definitely help shape my omega nerdy personality. But not a lot of people know the history of video games, where they come from, and where they are now. So I figured I'd give you guys a briefing as far as that goes. So video games, in their original sense, started in the 1940s and 50s. They were games that were designed to test AI in laboratories for rudimentary computers, and they were basically just on oscilloscopes, which are little things that go like that. And when these were being made, not a lot of people were keeping track of it because they were more interested in the AI that was being created at the time. But the first recorded video game was in 1958. And the only reason we know that is because there were numerous lawsuits about patent infringement because of this game. It was called Tennis for Two, and it was on an oscilloscope, so you can imagine how exciting that was. So we'll fast forward 20 years ahead to the 1970s, and this is when video games started to become closer to what they are today. Now, there were two forms of video games back then. There were arcade cabinets, which were big business, because these things, basically, you're putting a quarter into it every 60 seconds to keep playing, of course, because that's how you make money on these things, was to have people shove the quarters in. And if you adjust for inflation for 2014, you're shoving $1.50 into this thing every 60 seconds. So it was big business. And then the other side of the 1970s boom was the home consoles. Now, I'm sure you've all heard the name Pong at some point, which is pretty much just another derivation of Tennis for Two. So you had Mattel had the television and the Coleco, and then you also had Atari with their prototypical Atari 2600. And home consoles came into their own as well, to the point where in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a bubble of video games where people were just shoveling crap onto these consoles as fast as they could. And consequently, and this is personified in 1982 by a specific game I'll get to in a second, there was a bust. All these games were being made and no one was buying them anymore because they were crap. And it was personified in 1982 by the game E.T., which was supposed to tie in to the movie of the same name back in the day, but the controls were terrible. It had next to nothing to do with the game, and it just was a terrible game all around. And there was an urban legend that Atari made so many of these games that didn't sell that they took them all off the shelf, hundreds of thousands of copies of this game, and buried it in a landfill in New Mexico. And last year, as part of a documentary, they dug up this landfill and found copies of the game. But it wasn't hundreds of thousands of copies, it was just thousands of copies. So we're in the mid-1980s at this point, and video games are on their heels. Not everyone is going to see whether they're going to survive or not. And that is when I jumped into this story with the Nintendo Entertainment System. This thing was groundbreaking at the time. I have to say, Nintendo came back, they had their Nintendo seal of quality on it, so you knew it wasn't another E.T., and it had brand new controls. And this would set the pace for essentially the arms race for the next 30 years with Nintendo. They had a rival at another software company called Sega, and you might have heard of Sonic the Hedgehog. That was their mascot, versus Mario, who was Nintendo's mascot. And Atari was still in the fray for a while, but they started making some risky choices as far as their hardware went, and they eventually faded out of obscurity. You can still find their games in retro arcades if you want to play Pac-Man or something along those lines. So that takes us to what is called the second generation of video games. And then we jump over to the third generation, and this is where my heart will forever remain, which is the early 90s, and this is when the Super Nintendo comes out. And the Super Nintendo sold like gangbusters. It had some of the best games, in my personal, of course, objective opinion, ever made. And in this race, Sega was still in it, Nintendo was still in it, and then towards the end of that console, Sony started getting interested. And so then the next generation after that is when Sony steps up and they make their PlayStation 1, which is the first disc-based game ever, which provided animated cutscenes, better music, all these amazing technological advances for the time, respectively. And then it was an arms race between Nintendo and Sony, and Sega was starting to fall behind as well. Now, Sega eventually in the next generation would drop out and continue to make software, but they lost so much money on console hardware that they faded into obscurity, so to speak. And they're still having problems to this day, though they're still around, so good for them. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit to 2006, which is essentially the 7th generation of video games. And this is when Sony was out, but Xbox/Microsoft of PC fame swooped in and they took over that spot that was vacated by Sega. And so the next thing that Nintendo had to do was to bring in new players, because there were the hardcore-based people, but they wanted the casual demographic. So they created something that would change video games forever: motion controls. So you would have two things in your hand and it would process what you're doing, so it was a much more intuitive experience. And at that point, they made money hand over fist. That was last generation according to today's standards. And they sold over 112 million consoles at $250 a pop. It's a lot of money. They had a war chest of video game money to get into this generation, which is the 8th, and they've fallen far behind. But at that point, Sony introduced the PlayStation 3, which is just a power horse. It can do online storage, it has HD graphics. It is amazing. And that takes us to today, and I just want to take a minute. I'm going to go over time, I don't care. I just want to talk about what video games are like today. Now, it's a much more cinematic experience at this point. It's much more like a movie, and in point of fact, you need a director, you need an art director, you need storyboard artists, or 9. You can do full motion capture with actors. Ellen Page and Willem Dafoe did full motion capture for an over 1,000-page script for one video game. And there's also the revenue that's coming in. GTA 5 cost about $10,000 to make. And on its first day, it made $617 million. 3 days later, it crossed the $1 billion mark. And at the end of that week, it made $2 billion.